Hello and welcome to another edition of Puddleglum's Music Collection. Welcome, fellow Narnians. Today we're going to do a series on Larry Norman and his Trilogy albums. His Trilogy albums are his best known albums, except for maybe a couple others, but they are the ones that are usually associated with Larry Norman and his most creative point. It's considered his best works, that and maybe Something New Under the Sun, which came after it, which was delayed, by the way, for a few years. Larry Norman died on February 24th, 2008. Larry Norman is considered the father or the grandfather of Christian rock and roll. He definitely was not the first to add Christian lyrics or lyrics about the Bible or lyrics about evangelism or Jesus. He definitely wasn't the first, but in '69 he came out with an album on Capitol Records called Upon This Rock. Right here, after leaving People, he was in a band called People. That band had a small hit from one, I think the Animals did a song called I Love You. And, that was the hit off that album. And then Larry Norman went on his own. And did that album in 1969, which was considered, one of the basis for that because it was on Capitol Records. So it was, a Christian lyrical album with rock and roll on a major label, which was never even heard of at that time. But there were others before him, but he has been called the grandfather or the father of Christian rock and roll. Larry was sometimes controversial, sometimes he was political, sometimes he was evangelical, and, he was always too Christian for the secular market, even though he had a lot of good albums with some really great songs and some interesting lyrics. He was always too Christian for the secular market and too rock and roll for the church, because the church at that time, you couldn't even imagine rock and roll coming into the church. And Larry was doing this different contemporary music with lyrics that were biblical or about Jesus. But he also did a lot of other lyrics. I mean, everything he did, he tried to, I think, make a biblical song because the Bible talks about relationships. It has allegorical things. It has, and like Larry, he wanted to be artistic. He was an artist, so he had a lot of, allegorical things. He talked about relationships. And most of it was from a biblical perspective. And he was right there, the right place at the right time. The Jesus movement culture was starting in California with Calvary Chapel. Different hippies at the time were seeing that their life was empty with addictions, free love, etc. And they were coming to Christ after that. And places like Calvary Chapel in California was bringing them in, and they were a culture that was telling about evangelism and coming to Christ through their contemporary music, and Larry was the catalyst for that. A lot of bands came out of Calvary Chapel. I don't think Larry Norman he may have visited, but I don't think he was part of the Calvary Chapel. He was his own thing. So yeah, but today I'm not going to hit on a lot of controversies of Larry Norman's life. There's documentaries like from David D. Sabatino that, he took a lot of stuff and he conscried it, and he took interviews like from Pamela's ex-wife, and she totally says that he messed up those interviews and twisted them. But, I don't think Larry Norman was the devil that D. Sabatino made him. And I don't think Larry Norman was this great saint that other people make him. I think he's kind of in between. And nobody really knew a lot about Larry's life. He was kind of the Bob Dylan of the Christian market. He kind of liked to snow a lot of interviewers. And, he was not perfect by any means. But I don't think he was the worst person in the world either, kind of like all of us. And I'm hoping that the grace of God in the end, he settled up. But I think Larry Norman was... I've set up for him a few times, but, I don't know if anybody really knew Larry Norman that well. So, I know he had a lot of good things to say, and I think he was not as bad as everybody says he is, especially in that documentary where I don't even think the person who did the documentary is that much into the gospel or understands Christian point of view. But anyway, I'm not going to discuss a lot of that. I'm just going to mostly get into the 3 albums of the trilogy. The 3 albums of the trilogy are Only Visiting This Planet, and So Long Ago the Garden, and In Another Land. Those are the 3 that are known as the Trinity, or the trilogy, for Larry Norman. So I'm going to start off with Only Visiting This Planet. Only Visiting This Planet came out in 1972 on Verve Records. This was the 1972 release. I got this release with the white label from my friend John Jakowski. I believe I ordered it from him. So this is a white label release on Verve, Only Visiting This Planet. Now, Only Visiting This Planet was released again on Fido. It's probably released 100 other times. Fido had a different listing because Larry didn't like the listing on here that Verve did. But this is there's gatefolds and then there's trifolds. This is a trifold. The front is Larry Norman in New York City. Lots of cars and buildings around him, and his hands on his head kind of saying, where am I? I don't belong here. What's going on, you know? It's very confusing. And then on the back, you know, he has Stonehenge, which is a civilization that had disappeared, that was, you know, flourishing and huge, and it just disappeared. So he's kind of making, I think, a comment about, you know, if life is fleeting, you're only visiting here for a moment, and then everything can disappear. It's a trifold, you know, got the lyrics there. And then you've got this here. So yeah, it's a nice trifold cover. And his song on here that was pretty huge was I Wish We'd All Been Ready. Wish We'd All Been Ready during that time. Hal Lindsey came out with a book, you know, talking about the end times and the rapture, and the theology was really big then, and everybody thought, oh, we're going to be raptured by, whoever thought we'd make it to the 90s, you know, Jesus was coming back in the late 70s or the 80s maybe, you know, we got to be ready. So the rapture was a big theological point back then, especially for the Jesus movement, that Jesus was coming back really soon because of all the turmoil in the nation. Who would have thought it could get so much worse? So that was the view at the time. And so I Wish We'd All Been Ready was a big song off there that took off. He also released it on his later on Fido. He had a couple record labels. One was One Way, underground record label. One was Fido later. And then he had Solid Rock Records. I think this was. And this is the one that came out on Fido later. This is not a gatefold or a trifold. It's just an album. And this is the one that came out on his Fido Records with a different listing. On the Verve issue, the first song that started it out was Why Don't You Look Into Jesus? Why Don't You Look Into Jesus was a hard-hitting song to start it out. Good blues-based rock and roll. Some pretty controversial lyrics if you were in the church because it was so raw. And nobody was doing that stuff at the time. And I'm sure the church was like, oh, but it really, Larry was trying to reach the urban setting, those that really he felt the church weren't reaching and had no communication with. So that's what he was doing. You know, he had lyrics on there like Gonorrhea on Valentine's Day, VD. You're still looking for the perfect lay. Think rock and roll will set you free, honey. You'll be deaf before you're 33. Why don't you look into Jesus? He's got the answer. Which later, that song was redone on the third part of the trilogy, In Another Land, and he actually took that lyric out. I think he had it more towards a Christian audience then, trying to. I think a lot of it was to defend himself after So Long Ago the Garden, because that was such a controversial album. Everybody's like, "Oh, Larry's left the fold," whatever. Only Visiting This Planet had a lot of rough edges lyrically and, you know, politically, relationship-wise, and just talking to that raw sense of people that he felt were left behind by the church. So that started out the album, good rocker. Just side note, you know, John Wetton played bass on this. Wetton from King Crimson and Asia and other bands. He also passed away not so long Larry passed away on February 24th, 2008. And so Larry's been gone for a while now. But yeah, John Wetton played bass on this album. And then after that song on the Verve release was The Outlaw. The Outlaw was kind of a folky song. You know, reminded you a lot of the folk music era at that time. And the song was about Jesus, how some people perceived him. Some thought of him that he was an outlaw when he was on the earth. Some saw him as a healer. Some saw him as a politician because they're going to save him from the Roman government. And then the song, you know, concludes that he was our Savior, come to save all mankind. It's a very, very good song, and a lot of people loved it during that time of the Jesus movement. I've Got to Learn to Live Without You is a relationship song. Somebody that you love has left, and you're trying to cope with that. And that actually started the album out with the Fido release. He changed a lot of the tracking, and the Fido release started out with that because that's what he wanted the album to start out with. And I think Verve wanted to change the listing. I don't know which listing you like. I first heard Only Visiting This Planet from the Fido release, so I'm used to that starting out the album. But I think I kind of like the song Why Don't You Look Into Jesus actually starting it out. Righteous Rocker #1 was next on the Verve release. Righteous Rocker #1 was just in the movie Knives Out that came out not too long ago. It's way in the background during a restaurant scene where they're having a conversation. But everybody kind of noticed it that were Larry Norman fans. At the end, you saw, oh, Larry Norman was doing some music back here, which out of left field, you know. So if you looked on Spotify when that movie was out, all of a sudden Righteous Rocker was his #1 played song on there, which I don't think had ever been before. But it's way in the background. You have to really listen for it. Righteous Rocker is just one of those songs. It's kind of bluesy, laid back. You know, this song kind of takes that scripture. You're just a clanging noise. If you're doing all this stuff, you think for the Lord, and you're doing it without love, then you're just a clanging noise. That's basically what the song's about. I'm 6 O'Clock News was talking about Vietnam. And I think the stewardess in there, when it starts off on an airplane, I think that's Pamela, his wife at the time, doing this stewardess talking. That song is about a journalist going to Vietnam and seeing all the death and destruction and trying to report on it, and how it's just, you know, when media does things, it just kind of looks at it sometimes in a different way. He's looking at all this blood and everything, and then he's putting it on the news and telling about it. It's a very interesting look into how we see media, how media affects us, and journalism. And it's looking at it at that time with the Vietnam. The Great American Novel talked about America at the time trying to get to the moon, spending all this money trying to get to the moon when we had our own problems with racism then, and the Vietnam War going on, and all these things going on in America. And, you know, at the end he says, man leaves his darkness. When a man, don't ask me for the answers, I only got one. When a man leaves his darkness, man leaves his darkness when he follows the sun. Sun is S-O-N. So that was his political statement. And according to him, he's singing at the White House when they asked him not to do anything political. When he was singing at the White House, when Jimmy Carter was in, because Jimmy Carter was a fan, but he sang that song. That's the story anyway. Like I said, Larry Norman's full of a lot of stories. I'm pretty sure it happened. But Pardon Me is a dark song about an encounter sexually that was empty. I'm thinking it's about one night stands or free love, or, you know, any of those things, where, you know, it talks about a woman coming to somebody and then it's all empty. It's not real because there's no relationship there. There's no basis. So that's what that song was about. And Why Should the Devil Have All the Good Music was a song about the time period of the Jesus movement, when a lot of these people from the counterculture hippie movement were becoming Christians, and then they were telling about their testimony and different things through this new vehicle of rock and roll, and the church was not accepting it. And this song was kind of like a flagship or a theme for that time period where, hey, you know, I can use these bluesy rock riffs and this folk rock and contemporary music to talk about my faith and to talk about my personal things that I've gone through from a biblical perspective. And this was kind of a song for that movement. It's like a 50s rock vibe to it with a lot of saxophone and real jumpy. And, you know, it has the lyrics in it like, I don't like none of those funeral marches. I'm not dead yet. And so it's kind of like a 50s, you know, raucous song with a good saxophone. Reader's Digest pokes at the music industry at the time, kind of pokes at it that, you know, we brought all these people like the Beatles, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, we brought them all up as idols in our lives and the counterculture, and they told us how to live and what to do, and they were all kind of empty, you know. They all ended up committing suicide, and they all had addictions. You know, his famous line in there is like, Beatles said, all you need is love, and then they broke up. Yeah, things like that. So, you know, that was definitely a great song. It's definitely in the Bob Dylan kind of lyric, the way the lyrics are set up. Very Bob Dylan-ish. But I think he was trying to make a point with that. And then it ends with a little snippet at the end, "Oh, How I Love You," which isn't even listed on either one of the albums. I don't even know if it's on the Fido release. But "Oh, How I Love You" is like 30 seconds long or something. It's not very long. But of course, the end in Reader's Digest says, "Don't ask me, you know, for the answer. You know, don't ask me. I'm only visiting this planet." And most of the trilogies ended with the name of the album at the end. "I'm only visiting this planet, so long ago the garden in another land." The last lyrics were like, that was the name of the album. So great album. It's folking spots. It's rock and rolling spots. It very creative lyrics for the time. This is always put up there as one of the best Christian rock albums of all time. It's always 1 or 2 on a number of lists, and the 100 greatest Christian rock albums of all time is number 2. It's done in '72. One of the first albums to talk about biblical. One of the first Christian artists that had well done production with very creative lyrics. This isn't my favorite one from the trilogy. My favorite one is "So Long Ago the Garden," but this is usually people's favorite. This one and "In Another Land." "So Long Ago the Garden" was more controversial at the time, the cover and the lyrics. And I'll get into that during our next segment. This is the first segment, though. "So Long Ago," "Only Visiting This Planet." So yeah, that's it. If you want to go ahead and subscribe in the bottom, and you'll be able to watch my next. You don't have to if you don't want to, but you know, I kind of like people subscribing. I know I'm not that great, but you know, I feel like I'm talking about stuff that a lot of people have passed up musically. I mean, there's a whole generation of this kind of music from Christian artists that people have kind of forgotten about. There's a lot of legends here in this type of music. And hopefully it's kind of interesting. It's kind of a different thing. But yeah, Larry Norman, all you Narnians, I hope you have a great day. And we'll see you later at the next episode covering "So Long Ago the Garden." Thanks. Have a good day.